Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is brought to you by the Star Quest Production Network and is made possible by our many generous patrons. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give.
Last time on Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World.
Between August and November 1888, a horrifying series of murders took place in the Whitechapel district in East London. At least 5 working women were killed and mutilated. The killer was called by various names. He was known as the Whitechapel Murderer, Leather Apron, and most famously, as Jack the Ripper. His case received enhanced publicity when newspapers began publishing letters claiming to be from him. But Jack the Ripper was never caught. So Jimmy, what's our next episode going to be about?
Next week, we're going to be going through the suspects for who Jack the Ripper was, and I'll be revealing the one that I think the evidence points towards.
You're listening to episode 362 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, where we look at mysteries from the twin perspectives of faith and reason. In this episode, we're talking about who Jack the Ripper actually was. I'm Dom Bettinelli, and joining me today is Jimmy Akin. Hey, Jimmy.
Howdy, Dom.
Jack the Ripper killed 5 women in just a few months in 1888, but he was never caught, and he went on to become the most famous serial killer of all time. Last time we looked at the Ripper's crimes and some of the evidence, but today we'll be trying to figure out who he actually was, and Jimmy will be revealing the one suspect that he thinks the evidence most strongly points toward. That's what we'll be talking about on this episode of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. So Jimmy, what do we need to say to begin?
As always, in a true crime story, we're going to be keeping things clinical and not making the episode super scary. We're also past the worst of it since we looked at the Ripper's crimes last episode, but parents should still make prudent decisions for their families.
And so last episode, you identified 11 suspects out of more than 100 proposed ones that you said we'd be going through. Who were they?
In no particular order, they are Prince Albert Victor Christian Edward, known as Prince Eddie, Joseph Barnett, Dr. Francis Tumblety, Dr. Neill Cream, Severin Klosowski, James Maybrick, Montague Druitt, Michael Ostrog, Aaron Kosminski, David Cohen, and Nathan Kosminski.
And how do you want to go through them?
We'll start with the ones that are easiest to eliminate and work our way towards the more promising candidates. The first suspect to consider, the most sensationalistic one too, is Prince Albert Victor Christian Edward, known as Prince Eddie. He was the son of the future King Edward VII and Queen Alexandra. You'll remember her as one of the visitors from London High Society received by John Merrick, or the Elephant Man. In 1888, Prince Eddie was 24 years old, which is not an untypical age for when killers start killing. And there are a lot of rumors about him that led some to connect him with the Jack the Ripper crimes, and some really wild stories have been proposed. However, nobody back in his own day accused him of being Jack the Ripper. The idea that he might have been Jack the Ripper was not proposed until 1962. Now, the fact that no one accused him of being Jack the Ripper in 1888 could be due to the deference shown to a man of pedigree back in the day, but as sensationalistic and entertaining as Ripper scenarios involving Prince Eddie may be, they're all false. As a royal person, Prince Eddie's movements are well documented, and he has alibis for the murders. For example, on September 30th, the night of the double event, Eddie was at Balmoral Castle in Scotland, nowhere near Whitechapel in London. And he similarly couldn't have been present for any of the other murders, with numerous people serving as eyewitnesses to where he actually was at the times they were committed.
Then which suspect do you want to look at next?
His name is Dr. Neill Cream. He was born in Scotland, and he's also a suspect partly because he was a doctor. Some people have held that Jack the Ripper may have had some knowledge of human anatomy and surgery, though others at the time disputed this and didn't think that the mutilation showed any special knowledge of either of these areas. So the fact that Cream was a doctor doesn't really point strongly toward him. What's more, he was both a criminal and a serial killer. Douglas reports,
Dr. Neill Cream's checkered career Also includes arson, blackmail, and illegal abortions. He was found guilty of the strychnine poisoning of 4 London prostitutes in 1892, so you can see why his name comes up. On the scaffold, as he was about to be hanged, he is reputed to have declared, "I am Jack the," and then the trap door was released.
All of that, including the report of the aborted confession on the gallows, is really promising, but there are big problems with Cream as the Ripper. First, the aborted confession is apparently only rumor. I haven't seen any confirmation of it. And second,
as tantalizing as this is, we have another real problem with Cream, too. He is known to have been incarcerated at the Illinois State Penitentiary at Joliet from November 1881 into July 1891. So the American correctional system has given him his alibi.
So Cream, like Prince Eddie, has an ironclad alibi for all of the Ripper crimes. He was in America, in prison, when all of them occurred.
Then let's look at another proposed doctor who was a suspect. Who's he?
His name was Dr. Francis Tumblety, and he was a really strange guy. He also doesn't look like a real doctor, but someone who just claimed to be one. And as we've seen, whether the Ripper had any actual medical knowledge is disputed. Here's some background on him from John Douglas.
Francis Tumblety was born into a poor family in Ireland in the 1830s, the youngest of 11 children. While he was still a child, the family moved to Rochester, New York. From an early age, he was an energetic hustler, selling pornographic literature to canal boat travelers while still in his teens, then learning about medicines from a disreputable Rochester druggist. He ventured out into the world, beginning in Detroit, and set himself up as an herb doctor. Somehow he got people to fall for his claims, and he became rather well off. He would move from city to city, as authorities recognized him as a charlatan. He began wearing elaborate uniforms, and during the Civil War, moved to Washington, D.C., where he claimed to be a military surgeon and friend of President Abraham Lincoln and General Ulysses Grant. After the war, he traveled widely throughout the United States, getting in and out of trouble with the law. His personal life was shrouded in secrecy, though he was outwardly flamboyant, and at one point, he was sued by another man for sexual assault. Many people who knew him believed he disliked and avoided women. On November 7, 1888, he came to the attention of the Metropolitan Police in London when he was arrested for gross indecency and indecent assault with force and arms against 4 men beginning in July.
Afterwards, Tumblety jumped bail and fled the country. This would provide us with a reason why the Ripper crime suddenly stopped. However, he's still not a good candidate. Douglas reports,
in spite of this interesting finding, the fact that the murder stopped when he fled England, and all of the contemporary speculation about him, I don't find Tumblety a serious suspect. He was apparently homosexual, and I do not believe he would have had the passion and frenzy for such destructive overkills and mutilation of the other sex. I also believe it unlikely that the man who perpetrated the Kelly murder could have gone on to a functioning life afterward without any outward signs of the depraved behavior. Tumblety was a con man, the exact opposite of the unsub I'd be looking for. His constant hustles and flights show Tumblety to be an organized, intelligent individual, and as I've mentioned, I believe the actual Ripper to have been someone who would not seek personal publicity. Again, just the opposite of Tumblety. There is also every indication that he was still in police custody awaiting bail at the time of the Kelly murder.
all that makes a quite substantial case against him being the Ripper. He was apparently homosexual, he was too organized, he did seek publicity, and he was in jail when victim number 5 was killed. Next candidate.
Yes, there's another suspect who had medical knowledge, so let's look at him. Who is he?
He's known by the name George Chapman, but his real name was Severin Klosowski. And like Dr. Cream, he also is a convicted serial killer. Douglas reports.
Severin Klosowski was born in Poland, where he apprenticed in surgery. He came to England in 1887 and worked as a hairdresser and barber. He becomes a suspect because of this physical proximity to the murders, and the fact that between 1895 and 1901, and now calling himself George Chapman, after the woman he cohabited with, who, coincidentally, shared the name Annie Chapman with the second Ripper victim, he poisoned 3 successive women with whom he had lived as husband. He was charged, tried, convicted, and executed by hanging in April 1903.
So Chapman or Klosowski was a serial killer, but he's not a good candidate for the Ripper. In the first place, his medical training doesn't count for much since whether the Ripper had any is disputed. Furthermore, he was still living in London after the Ripper crime ceased, and in his case, there's no good explanation for why a series of frenzied crimes like that would stop. Also, he was married to multiple women, suggesting that he didn't have a problem forming relationships with women. And that is very unlikely for the Ripper, whose ritual mutilation fantasies indicate that the killer was not capable of having normal relations with women. Douglas argues,
he had relationships with women, which I do not believe the Ripper would have. He was organized enough to marry and dispatch 3 women in succession, though since he probably wasn't technically married to any of them, the profit motive doesn't really come into play here. Still, there is no way a man hacks apart 5 or 6 women, lies low for 10 years with no one noticing anything about him, then resumes his homicidal career as a poisoner, who, along with bombers, are the most cowardly and detached of all murderers.
So yeah, the kind of disorganized killer who savagely attacks women with a knife in public and then ritually mutilates them is not the type of organized killer who slyly plans and poisons the women he lives with in private. Those are 2 completely different types of individuals.
Which suspect would you like to consider next?
He's a recently proposed one, and his name is James Maybrick. Maybrick was a cotton broker from Liverpool in the north of England. In 1993, he was proposed as a possible Jack the Ripper. The basis for this was a diary that was given in 1991 by a drinking buddy to a man named Michael Barrett, who was a scrap metal dealer in Liverpool. The diary does not contain Maybrick's name, but it contains enough clues that you can tell who it's supposed to be by. The diary claims that the reason for the murders was that Maybrick thought his wife was cheating on him, and he thought of her as a whore. And unable to kill her, he traveled down to London and killed actual prostitutes there instead. Also, in support of the idea that Maybrick was the killer was the 1993 appearance of a pocket watch that contained the name J, that's the initial J, Maybrick. It also had the words, "I am Jack," and the initials of the canonical 5 victims scratched into it. When it comes to the diary, Douglas reports,
a number of forensic factors suggest the diary is fake. There is evidence that much of the writing was done at only a few sittings, rather than episodically, as an actual journal would have been. A Scotland Yard examiner stated that many of the handwriting flourishes appear to have been added after the writing was completed, to make it look more authentically Victorian. Martin Fido, one of the experts called in to evaluate the diary before publication, found about 20 anachronisms in the text. Some of the descriptions appear to be based on newspaper accounts, rather than what was later learned to have actually taken place. Then there were certain crime scene issues. The writer speaks of a hideout on Middlesex Street, or Petticoat Lane. Yet why would the killer of Catherine Eddowes, clearly on the run from the police, flee from Mitre Square and past Middlesex Street to drop the bloody apron in Galston Street, then return to Middlesex Street? It doesn't make sense. Even more to the point, how does a 50-year-old man with a family, children, and no sociopathology suddenly blossom into a disorganized serial killer? He can't, and doesn't. Anyone who thinks his situation through enough to decide that he wants to kill prostitutes to get back at his wife, but must do so on trips to another city, where he'll hide out, stalk women of the night, rip them up, and then return to his own world and home, would not exactly be disorganized. In fact, I've never seen one that organized. No one plans that carefully, then goes into such a frenzy of sexual pathology. And even if he did, he wouldn't be able to return to normal life after that without someone recognizing something about his post-offense behavior. I have seen many diaries and writings of serial killers. This one is noteworthy not so much for what it doesn't get wrong, as for what it fails to reveal. If this diary were authentic, I would expect it to shed some new light on the crimes or their methodology, which is missing here. In a real killer's diary, I'd expect to see his whole pathological construct laid out, rather than just a simple, breastbeating excuse for why he has to kill these women. All of that is missing from the so-called Maybrick diary, which must be judged an elaborate fake.
In addition, in 1995, Michael Barrett, the man who said the diary was given to him by a drinking buddy, swore out 2 affidavits in which he said that he dictated the diary to his wife, who wrote it down. Well, there is some confusion here, since Barrett's solicitor later repudiated the affidavits, though Barrett himself then withdrew the repudiation. So the diary does really, really look fake.
And what about the pocket watch?
Tests were done on it in 93 and 94, and they said that it looked good. The carvings on it were not an obvious forgery and looked like they were several decades old, but this could not be proved conclusively. To my mind, the watch did not emerge until 2 years after the diary, and the diary is a fake, suggesting that the watch could just be a clever forgery intended as confirmatory evidence. The truly decisive factor is what Douglas explored, which is that it's not plausible that a businessman up in Liverpool in the north would go down to Whitechapel in London in the south to kill prostitutes to get back at his wife. Even setting aside the irrationality of such a revenge plan, it would show an extraordinary level of planning and foresight, which is simply inconsistent with the disorganized, frenzied public attacks made by the Ripper. I thus think Maybrick is a poor candidate.
Then who's our next suspect?
His name is Joseph Barnett, and he's already been in our story. He was the sometimes live-in boyfriend of victim number 5, or Mary Jane Kelly. Now, when a person is found dead at home, the immediate members of their household are always the initial suspects. So, since Barnett sometimes lived with Kelly, he was immediately suspected, and the police took him into custody. Douglas reports,
Joseph Barnett was subjected to 4 hours of intense questioning by the police. They took his clothing and examined it for bloodstains and other clues. They were satisfied he was not the killer. Recently, however, he has again emerged as a suspect, most prominently in the work of Bruce Paley, whose book, Jack the Ripper, The Simple Truth, was published in 1995. The theory is that he murdered the other women to scare Mary into giving up prostitution, and that he finally killed her in a mad frenzy when it became clear that she had tired of him and would not take him back. During his interrogation by police, Barnett admitted that he frequently read Mary newspaper accounts of the Whitechapel murders. This theory offers an explanation of why the murders stopped, because they did, with Kelly's death. Proponents of Barnett's candidacy also point out that he was skilled with knives, had some rudimentary knowledge of anatomy, was a local who felt comfortable in the area, and could, therefore, probably approach local hookers without alarming them, and generally fits the eyewitness descriptions. Barnett would, obviously, have easy access to Kelly's room.
However, all this is speculative. None of it proves that Barnett was responsible, and there are significant problems with it. As Douglas states,
I have never seen, nor do I believe someone would, in this manner, brutally kill women he knows, even vaguely, to scare his own partner and teach her a lesson. Particularly on the night of the double event, a guy of this type would have been scared off by the first one. He would have never gone after Catherine Eddowes. The motive just doesn't work. Yes, there are sadists who get off by torturing women, but the mutilation here is all post-mortem, so that doesn't fit. Also, these are not planned, considered kills. They're frenzied, out-of-control overkills. If the perpetrator were someone with a personal relationship with the victim, we might expect to see some degree of overkill in stabbing or wounds to the face, but not this kind of ritual mutilation that Mary Jane Kelly's body was subjected to. There's no pattern or internal logic to it. No one who has had a relatively normal relationship with a woman, as Barnett evidently did, could perpetrate this kind of crime.
I thus agree with Douglas and the police back in 1888 that Barnett was not responsible for the Ripper crimes.
We're now at a turning point in our consideration of suspects. What's different about the ones we're about to look at?
Unlike the ones we've considered thus far, the ones that we're about to consider were considered significant suspects by the police back in the 1880s. We know this from several sources. The first is a confidential memorandum written in 1894 by Sir Melville Leslie Macnaghten, who was Assistant Commissioner for the Metropolitan Police's Criminal Investigation Department, or CID. The second source is a memoir written by Sir Robert Anderson, which appeared in a book called The Lighter Side of My Official Life. And the third source is a set of handwritten notes known as the Swanson Marginalia. They were written in the margins of The Lighter Side of My Official Life, a copy of it, by Chief Inspector Donald Swanson.
Then let's look at each of these. What did Sir Melville Macnaghten have to say in his confidential memorandum?
He wrote that the killer was likely one of three men. He said,
Number 1, a Mr. M.J. Druitt, said to be a doctor and of a good family, who disappeared at the time of the Miller's Court murder, whose body, which was said to have been upwards of a month in the water, was found in the Thames on the 31st of December, or about 7 weeks after that murder. He was sexually insane, and from private info I have little doubt but that his own family believed him to have been the murderer. Number 2, Kosminski, a Polish Jew and resident in Whitechapel. This man became insane owing to many years' indulgence in solitary vices. He had a great hatred of women, especially of the prostitute class, and had strong homicidal tendencies. He was removed to a lunatic asylum about March 1889. There are many circumstances connected with this man which make him a strong suspect. Number 3, Michael Ostrog, a Russian doctor and a convict, who was subsequently detained in a lunatic asylum as a homicidal maniac. This man's antecedents were of the worst possible type, and his whereabouts at the time of the murders could never be ascertained.
So those are the three names that Macnaghten pointed to: Montague Druitt, Aaron Kosminski, and Michael Ostrog.
Then let's take a look at those three before we look at what else we can learn from our other sources about who the police suspected. What can we say about Montague Druitt as a candidate?
Well, one thing to note is that there's an error in Macnaghten's 1894 confidential memo. He says that Druitt was said to be a doctor and of good family, but he actually wasn't a doctor. Apparently, someone told Macnaghten this, but it wasn't true. In reality, Montague Druitt was a teacher at a boys' school. He also had recently qualified as a barrister and was beginning a parallel career in the law. The thing that makes him interesting as a Ripper suspect is when he died. Douglas reports,
Druitt is an interesting suspect primarily because of when he died. He was pulled out of the Thames on December 31st, 1888, and police estimated he'd been in there more than a month. His coat was weighted down with stones, and he had cash on him, and 2 checks from the boys' school in Blackheath where he taught. They were probably severance checks.
So Druitt was dismissed from his position at the boys' school on November 30th, the last day of November 1888. He committed suicide by jumping into the Thames River, and he weighted his body with stones so that it would stay submerged. Consequently, it remained undiscovered until the last day of December. He thus apparently committed suicide right at the beginning of December. So his death at the end of November would explain why the Ripper murders stopped at the beginning of November. But the fit isn't very good. The Ripper had been attacking women every couple of weeks during the months he was active, but there were 3 weeks at least between the murders of victim number 5, Mary Jane Kelly, on November 9th, and when Druitt committed suicide at the beginning of December. This means that we need to consider whether there was another plausible explanation for his suicide. And there is. His dismissal from his position at the boys' school. Losing a job like that, especially in the high-pressure, socially conscious Victorian world, could be devastating for a man with social ambitions, especially if he was dismissed for a reason that could in some way be shameful.
Do we know why Druitt was let go from the school?
Unfortunately, no. Some have suggested that he was let go because he made advances to some of the boys he was supposed to be teaching, but this is speculative and we don't know that. The speculation is apparently based on Macnaghten's statement that he was sexually insane, but that could mean a lot of things. It's also been pointed out that his family had a history of mental illness. His maternal grandmother had gone insane and committed suicide. His aunt had committed suicide. His eldest sister had committed suicide, and his mother had been confined to an asylum in July of 1888, just a few months earlier. Well, given his family background and the recent institutionalization of his mother, that could have caused him to have mental health problems, and these problems could have led to his dismissal from the school. After his disappearance, they found a note that he had written to his brother in which Druitt had said,
"Since Friday, I felt that I was going to be like Mother, and the best thing for me was to die."
So, taking the evidence at face value, that suggests Druitt felt his mental state was deteriorated in the same way their mothers had, and that he would end up in an asylum the way she did, so he decided to take his life. The Friday he refers to is likely Friday, November 30th, the day that he was terminated at the boys' school, which would point to his dismissal being linked to his deteriorating mental health. There are also other problems with Druitt as a candidate. He did live in London, but not the right part. He was upper middle class and had studied in Oxford. He was not the kind of impoverished person who lived in Whitechapel. Druitt lived miles away on the other side of the Thames, and even if he went to Whitechapel to murder women, it's unlikely that he could have gotten home without people noticing his bloody clothes. Furthermore, we have evidence that he lived in the wrong direction. After the murder of victim number 4, Catherine Eddowes, in the double event, the killer dropped a piece of her apron, escaping from the scene. And if you connect the two sites where the apron was found and the murder scene, it's clear that the killer was traveling to the northeast, but Druitt's home was to the southwest. And there's a timeline problem, because we know that Druitt was 130 miles away in Dorset playing cricket, which was one of his hobbies, on September 1st, 1888, the day after victim number 1 was killed. All in all, I don't think Druitt is a good candidate, and I also agree with Douglas, who writes,
"I've always been a little surprised by the weight given to Druitt's candidacy as the Ripper. Aside from his untimely but convenient death, nothing really ties him to the crimes, including any known association with Whitechapel. There is no evidence of violence in his background, and a man doesn't just jump full-blown into the kinds of crimes we're talking about."
Then what about one of the other candidates MacNaughton named, Michael Ostrog?
Ostrog was an immigrant to England from Russia. He was born around 1833, which meant that he was around 55 years old at the time of the Whitechapel killings. He also was a criminal, being a con man and a thief. Ostrog would make up stories about his life, like he had been a surgeon in the Russian Navy. He would use fake names and wear costumes, and he stole a bunch of items, but he wasn't very good at it and was repeatedly caught, convicted, and jailed. In fact, he was in prison for 10 years leading up to March of 1888, when he was released a few months before the Ripper murders. On the subject of the latter, Douglas reports,
"He was too old and too tall to match the witness accounts. He was imprisoned in September of 1887, but transferred to Surrey Pauper Lunatic Asylum when he displayed signs of insanity, probably faked, then released in March 1888. Since he was sentenced to prison for theft in Paris on November 18th, it's unlikely he was even in London at the time of all the Ripper murders. He surfaces again in London in 1904, partially crippled, and living in the St. Giles Christian Mission. The police were definitely paying attention to him, and were concerned during the murder series when he failed to report to them as directed. That he was in and out of mental institutions also probably had something to do with MacNaughton's interest in him. But again, I find nothing compelling in the facts we know to suggest that he might be the Ripper. Nothing else in his background suggests a propensity toward the type of savage violence we see in these crimes. And despite the mental illness, he seems too organized and together to fit the personality I'd be looking for.
Ostrog also did not have a history of violence. His activity as a con man and a thief could classify him as a white-collar criminal, but not as one prone to violent public knife attacks. Also, his situation with jail makes him an even worse candidate than Douglas mentions, because records have emerged indicating that Ostrog was in France and in prison during the months of 1888 when the Ripper murders were committed. So the French penal system gives him an ironclad alibi.
Okay, That would leave us with one remaining suspect of the three that McNaughton named, Aaron Kosminski. But you said we had two other police sources about who they suspected the Ripper to be. What do they suggest about this possibility?
They both confirm it. First, Sir Robert Anderson's memoir points in the same direction, but he doesn't explicitly name the perpetrator. Anderson's memoir comes in two forms. The first to be published was a series of articles in Blackwood's magazine in 1910, and the second, shortly after and also in 1910, was an edited version of these articles in book form as The Lighter Side of My Official Life. There are slight differences between the two, so we'll look at both. By the way, I should mention that Anderson is about to use the term low class, and he means that in a 19th century British way, not a 21st century American way. In other words, by saying that someone is low class, he means that they were from the lower economic class. It's a statement of economic fact, not the kind of insult it would be here. First, in a Blackwood's article from March of 1910, Anderson wrote,
"The conclusion we came to was that he and his people were low-class Polish Jews. I will only add that when the individual whom we suspected was caged in an asylum, the only person who ever had a good view of the murderer at once identified him. But when he learned that the suspect was a fellow Jew, he declined to swear to him."
In the book, this passage was edited to say,
"The conclusion we came to was that he and his people were low-class Polish Jews. I will merely add that the only person who had ever had a good view of the murderer unhesitatingly identified the suspect the instant he was confronted with him. But he refused to give evidence against him. In saying that he was a Polish Jew, I am merely stating a definitively ascertained fact, and my words are meant to specify race, not religion, for it would outrage all religious sentiment to talk of the religion of a loathsome creature whose utterly unmentionable vices reduce him to a lower level than that of the brute."
Now, Anderson does not name the suspect here, but it would appear that he's referring to Aaron Kosminski, since Kosminski was the only Polish Jew among the three suspects named by McNaughton. Anderson also seems to shed light on why Kosminski was never prosecuted. In the original magazine version of the memoir, he indicates that when Kosminski was caged in an asylum, so he was already in custody, he was confronted by the only person who had ever gotten a good look at the killer. Anderson doesn't name that eyewitness, but he's probably referring to the cigarette salesman Joseph Lewende, who saw the killer talking with victim number 4, or Catherine Eddowes, just before she was murdered, and who saw the killer from only 9 feet away. In both versions of the memoir, Anderson says that the eyewitness immediately identified Kosminski as the killer, but that when he learned Kosminski was a fellow Jew, he refused to swear in court that he was the killer, and Lewende, like Kosminski, was also a Polish Jew.
Why do you think he would refuse to give evidence against Kosminski in court upon learning that he was a fellow Jew?
Likely because Kosminski was already in custody. He was in an asylum and couldn't kill any more prostitutes. And because if he did swear in court that Kosminski was the killer, it could feed or fuel British anti-Semitism among Gentiles and potentially cause the same kind of anti-Jewish persecution that had caused many Russian and Polish Jews to flee their homelands and come to England. It also could bring down the wrath of the Jewish community on Lewende. They could say to him, "You're an immigrant Jew yourself, and it's hard enough for us here already. You know, Kosminski was already in custody and off the street, so he couldn't continue. Why would you bring down the wrath of the English upon us?" Lewende could thus find himself ostracized and perhaps unemployed or unemployable in the already impoverished Whitechapel. Also, if Kosminski was convicted, he would have been executed, and Lewende may not have wanted that on his conscience. So I think there were understandable reasons why Kosminski would refuse to identify him given the circumstances.
If Anderson's memoir suggests that the killer was Kosminski, what about the margin notes that Donald Swanson wrote in his copy of Anderson's memoir?
There are several relevant notes in the marginalia. The first occurs where Anderson talks about the Polish Jew that the eyewitness refused to give courtroom evidence against, and Swanson wrote,
"Because the suspect was also a Jew, and because his evidence would convict the suspect, and the witness would be the means of the murderer being hanged, which he did not wish to be left on his mind.
He also wrote,
And after this identification, which the suspect knew, no other murder of this kind took place in London.
and then at the end of the book he wrote,
After the suspect had been identified at the seaside home where he had been sent by us with difficulty, in order to subject him to identification, and he knew he was identified. On suspect's return to his brother's house in Whitechapel, he was watched by police, City CID, by day and night. In a very short time, the suspect, with his hands tied behind his back, he was sent to Stepney Workhouse, and then to Conley Hatch, and died shortly afterwards. Kosminski was the suspect.
So here Swanson confirms that Aaron Kosminski was the subject, though he is mistaken about one fact. Kosminski did not die shortly after he was transferred to the Conley Hatch Lunatic Asylum. He actually continued to live until 1919, which was 28 years later. Providing some additional background on Kosminski, Douglas reports,
Kosminski was a hairdresser who moved to England in 1882. The records of the large Conley Hatch Lunatic Asylum, which would have handled most of the patients in and around Whitechapel, listed attacks of mental illness going back to 1885. By the late 1880s, he was known to wander about, picking food scraps out of the street, and would refuse food offered by anyone else. He would not wash, and had at one point threatened his sister with a knife. From 1890 on, he essentially spent the rest of his life in asylums.
It thus appears that all three of our major police sources have Aaron Kosminski as a Ripper suspect, with McNaughton saying he was a strong suspect, and Anderson and Swanson saying he was immediately identified by the only eyewitness as the killer, though we wouldn't give evidence in court against him. What can you say about Kosminski as a suspect?
well, the idea that he was the killer apparently continued to be a popular belief at Scotland Yard. In his book, Naming Jack the Ripper, Russell Edwards reports that in a conversation with Alan McCormick, the curator of the Yard's Crime Museum, he was told that the murderer was and always had been Kosminski. FBI profiler John Douglas also thought that Kosminski was a likely candidate. He wrote,
Aaron Kosminski looked good for the murders. A Polish-Jewish immigrant hairdresser with a history of mental illness and a reported dislike of women, he fit the eyewitness descriptions, the disorganized personality, and the police descriptions. The escalation of mutilation and depravity in the murders was dramatic, and the Mary Jane Kelly kill certainly strikes me as the work of a guy pretty much at the end of his mental rope. It suggests that he might not be able to continue functioning on his own much longer. And a guy who eats garbage off the streets rather than accept food from anyone would tend to fit the bill.
Douglas also developed a criminal profile of Jack the Ripper for a TV documentary that he participated in, and the profile corresponded to Kosminski. Douglas concluded,
Although Kosminski seemed to fit my profile and evaluation, I cautioned on the show that 100 years after the fact, I could not prove that he was the actual killer. What I said was that Jack the Ripper would either be Aaron Kosminski or someone like the man I was describing, and I stand by that.
So that's promising, but Douglas noted that the case for Kosminski was open to challenge based on some factors he learned about after the program. He noted that Swanson had been mistaken about when Kosminski died, a fact we already mentioned. He also noted that during his time in mental institutions, Kosminski was often in a dissociated psychological state, but he usually wasn't that violent. And he didn't talk, so far as anyone knew, about being Jack the Ripper, which you might expect an institutionalized crazy person to do, especially in an effort to threaten and intimidate other inmates or asylum workers to get what he wanted.
This leads us to our final two suspects who were also Polish Jews. Their names were given as David Cohen and Nathan Kosminski. What should we know about them?
To understand the case for them being Ripper suspects, we need to look at how their names emerged. Douglas writes,
Martin Fido had also believed that the man the police referred to as Kosminski was the answer to the Ripper mystery. But the problem struck him as just as real as they did me. Knowing that the Polish Jew description from Anderson was more reliable than the name, Fido exhaustively checked the records of all the prisons and insane asylums in the area. And of all the names he went through, he came up with one fascinating candidate. David Cohen was a Polish Jew, 23 years of age at the time, exactly the same age as Kosminski, whose incarceration at Conley Hatch fits precisely with the end of the murders. He had originally been brought by police to Whitechapel Infirmary on December 12, 1888, when they found him wandering at large and unable to take care of himself. Unlike Kosminski, Cohen was violently antisocial and was kept in restraints. When he was given any clothing, he would rip it off his body. He spoke little, and when he did, it was a foreign language that attendants took to be German. Though we know he was in Whitechapel at the time of the crimes, we don't know where he lived or if he actually had a job. He became ill on December 28th, and while he gradually regained some of his strength during the spring and summer of 1889, he suffered a relapse and died on October 20th. The cause of death was put down to exhaustion of mania. This diagnosis, rather crude by modern standards, still fits in perfectly with the profile. The killer and mutilator of Mary Jane Kelly was at the end of his emotional rope. His address had been given as 86 Lehman Street, an unlikely possibility, since this was the address of the Protestant Boys Club. However, Fido quickly discovered that number 84 was a temporary shelter for poor homeless Jews, which seemed completely logical. But this home only accepted newly landed immigrants for 2 weeks. Immigrant Jews taken in by their fellow immigrants in this way were often listed for employment in one of the traditional Jewish trades, either tailor or shoemaker. Cohen is listed as a tailor, but it is certainly possible that he had been a shoemaker. The connection of shoemakers with leather apron would have been enough to change the designation for his own protection.
That's rather a lot, so let me break it down. David Cohen was in Whitechapel at the time of the crimes. He was brought to the Whitechapel Infirmary on December 12, 1888, just over a month after the attack on victim number 5, or Mary Jane Kelly. He was violent and had to be kept in restraints, and he may have boasted about being Jack the Ripper since he spoke little and in what many took to be German. Other sources say that the language David Cohen spoke in the asylum was Yiddish rather than German, but Yiddish is a Germanic language, so the two can be confused, especially by a nar who doesn't know Bupkis and can't recognize the difference between them. He also died on October 20th, 1889, which was shortly after he was committed to the Conley Hatch Lunatic Asylum, just as Swanson said. It's thus possible that Swanson was right that the killer was a Polish Jew who was committed to Conley Hatch and died shortly afterwards, but that he confused this individual with Aaron Kosminski when it was really David Cohen.
But then, how do you explain the confusion of names? Aaron Kosminski and David Cohen don't sound like each other.
This is a confusion that will lead to our next suspect, Nathan Kosminski. Douglas continues,
It's easy to see how 84 Lehman Street could be mistranscribed as 86. But how do you confuse Kosminski and Cohen? Well, one possible way was explained to Fido. Cohen was a John Doe type surname, often given to Jewish immigrants whose actual surnames were difficult for Englishmen to pronounce or spell. It is therefore possible that the city police were following Kosminski, while Scotland Yard, that is the Metropolitan Police, was following Cohen. The Yard knew their man had died, but weren't certain of his real name. The situation is further complicated by another fellow, generally referred to as Nathan Kosminski, an immigrant Jewish bootmaker, the same age and general description as both Kosminski and Cohen. He was treated for syphilis in a workhouse infirmary shortly before the murders, and then suddenly and inexplicably vanishes from the records. He lived right in the heart of the Ripper's comfort zone. There are no death records for him. So I think there is every chance that these 3 immigrant Polish Jews with documented emotional problems were combined and confused by the various police officials and agencies.
So Douglas thinks that it's quite possible that the 2 police agencies confused Aaron Kosminski and Nathan Kosminski. and that these were confused with the John Doe name David Cohen, which was used for individuals whose true identity you didn't know or couldn't pronounce easily. In the end, Douglas says,
I don't set much store in elaborate conspiracies and cover-ups, but I've seen enough bureaucratic gaffes and fumbles in my time to believe quite heartily in them. And yet, what is the element of truth or consistency that runs throughout the three accounts and also squares with the profile of the Whitechapel murderer? As we've seen, it's impossible to be certain of the true identity after all these years. But the behavioral evidence as to the type of individual he was is plentiful and compelling. Therefore, I am now prepared to say that Jack the Ripper was either the man known to the police as David Cohen or someone very much like him.
So after he did the TV documentary, Douglas was prepared to endorse Aaron Kosminski or someone very much like him, and he later stood by that. But based on what he had learned since the documentary, he revised his position to endorse David Cohen or someone very much like him, the presumed resolution being that Aaron Kosminski and David Cohen were very much like each other. We're thus looking at a situation that possibly involved three individuals, Kosminski, Kosminski, and Cohen, on the assumption that all three were separate. Or it might just involve two individuals, Kosminski and Kosminski, on the assumption that Cohen was a John Doe name applied to Kosminski.
Is there any way to break this deadlock and determine who Jack the Ripper was?
Potentially, the way we do it today is by using DNA, which was unknown in 1888, but that's what we need to look at next.
And before we do that, we'd like to take a moment to thank our patrons who make this show possible, including Ray M., Rebecca R., J.S., Kim L., and Laura M. Their generous donations at sqpn.com/give make it possible for us to continue Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World and all the shows at StarQuest. And you can join them by visiting sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you by DeliverContacts.com, offering top brand contact lenses at always low prices with free delivery. Visit DeliverContacts.com. And by The Grady Group, a Catholic company bringing financial clarity to their clients across the United States, using safe money options to produce reasonable rates of return for their clients. Learn more at GradyGroupInc.com. So, Jimmy, what do we need to know about what light DNA evidence may shed on the question of who Jack the Ripper was? As we discussed back in episode 38 on how we caught the Golden State Killer, we've now been using DNA to solve crimes from before DNA technology was discovered. Do we have anything that might contain Jack the Ripper's DNA?
The claim is that we do, and to explain that, I need to tell you a bit of a story. Last episode, I mentioned that a silk shawl was reportedly found at the scene of victim number 4, or Catherine Eddowes' killing, and I said that it would come back into our story. Well, this is the point at which that happens. First, here's a description of the shawl. It's taken from Russell Edwards' book, Naming Jack the Ripper.
It was surprisingly large and existed in two sections, the bigger one being 73.5 inches in length and 25.5 inches wide. The smaller piece had been cut more and was 24 inches long and 19 inches wide. The predominant color was dark brown, with a more golden brown on the reverse. At both ends were blue sections, measuring about 2 foot long, patterned with a design of Michaelmas daisies and golden lilies in hues of red, ochre, and gold. This pattern also ran along the edges of the main brown central section in the form of a border. Pieces had been cut from the shawl at some time, leaving jagged edges at one end of the piece. The other edges of both sections had a fringe of small tassels.
I should also point out that the reverse side of the shawl was considerably plainer than the other and did not have the same intricate designs. The shawl also has a few stains on it, which will become important as we go along. The shawl was reportedly found on Catherine Eddowes' body, and it's at this point that a new character enters our story. His name was Amos Simpson, and he was acting sergeant with the Metropolitan Police. According to Edwards,
Simpson, being on special duties at the time of the double murder, had gone to Mitre Square with several other officers from both the city and metropolitan forces, and with another policeman, accompanied the body of Catherine Eddowes as it was wheeled to the city mortuary in Golden Lane. Seeing the shawl, he asked one of the senior officers if it was fine to take it, as he thought his wife Jane might find the silk useful for dressmaking. David Melville Hayes, the great-great-nephew of Simpson, believes that it was his rank, acting sergeant, that allowed him to have the shawl. When Simpson showed the blood-stained shawl to Jane, she understandably wanted nothing to do with it.
Jane Simpson didn't want to use that murder shawl for any dressmaking, so it ended up being preserved. The shawl was then passed down through the Simpson family, and for a time it was loaned to Scotland Yard's Crime Museum, also known as the Black Museum. But in 2007, it was put up for auction and acquired by Russell Edwards. Edwards is a researcher with an interest in the Jack the Ripper case, and he had the idea of buying the shawl and then taking it for scientific testing to see if it could be validated. He thus began working with scientists and historical experts to check it out.
And what did they discover?
Well, one of the first things they discovered was that it probably did not belong to Catherine Eddowes. It was old enough to belong to her. It was apparently woven in the early 1800s, but it was too expensive for Eddowes to own. You'll recall from last episode that she had chronic money problems and even had to pawn a pair of her boyfriend's boots shortly before she was killed to get money for them to have food. The shawl was much too high quality and too expensive to have been hers, and she would have hawked it immediately. Also, Eddowes had an outdoor lifestyle. You'll recall that she and her boyfriend had gone hopping down in Kent shortly before the double event, which means that she walked all the way to Kent and all the way back, and Britain has a notoriously damp climate with quite a bit of rain. But the shawl has a pattern on it that uses an old-fashioned blue dye that is not color fast. So if it was ever exposed to water, either by being washed or by being worn out in the rain, this dye would have bled out of it. And that definitely would have happened if Eddowes had been wearing it around her given her outdoor lifestyle.
Then it sounds like the shawl was not hers. So why does it have any relevance in our story?
Well, Edwards got in touch with scientists who could do DNA testing on the shawl. In particular, he got in touch with Dr. Jari Louhelainen. He's originally from Finland, but he lectures in the UK, and he does forensic DNA work, so he's an expert in the relevant field. He extracted blood from the bloodstains on the shawl and verified that it was human blood. He further did a test on the mitochondrial DNA in the stains. Mitochondrial DNA is not part of the nucleus of the DNA. It's in tiny organelles called mitochondria, and the mitochondrial DNA comes exclusively from one's mother. So you and all your siblings, regardless of sex, have the same mitochondrial DNA or mtDNA as your mother. Dr. Louhelainen compared the mtDNA from the bloodstains to the mtDNA of one of the descendants of Catherine Eddowes' mother, and it was a match. In a later peer-reviewed paper that he published, the odds of it matching anyone selected at random from a European population were estimated to be 1.3 times 10 to the negative third. That is, the odds of a random match would be 1.3 people out of 1,000 or 13 people out of 10,000, which is quite a close match. So given the report that the shawl was taken from Catherine Eddowes' body, and given the odds that a random match for the bloodstains that were found on it and Catherine Eddowes being literally 1 in 1,000, it appears that the report of the shawl being taken from her body is true.
Why would the shawl have been on Eddowes' body if it didn't belong to her?
To understand that, you need to understand what the historical analysis of the shawl revealed. As I mentioned, it was originally woven in the early 1800s, decades before the Ripper murders. But the historical analysis also revealed that it was of Eastern European origin, and that fits with the identification of the either 2 or 3 suspects we're currently looking at as Jewish immigrants. Kosminski, and Cohen were all Eastern European Jewish immigrants. So this would suggest that the shawl did not belong to the victim, but to the killer. And the killer may have brought it along as an inducement to get Eddowes to become involved with him. Hey, baby, look at this pretty shawl I have here. You could have this. It would look real nice on you. You could even fetch a pretty penny for it if you want to sell it.
Okay, then there's a plausible explanation for how the shawl came to be on Catherine Eddowes' body and a link to some of the current suspects we're looking at, but it still doesn't tell us which of the suspects it was.
Except it turned out that it wasn't just bloodstains that were on the shawl. In addition, there were stains that had been left by fluid containing male germ cells. The adults in the audience will know what I'm talking about. They were able to recover DNA from these male germ cells or the fluid and compare them to a family member of one of the suspects.
Don't keep us in suspense. Who was the suspect and what did the test reveal?
Russell Edwards had been told by an official from Scotland Yard that the agency was sure that Aaron Kosminski was Jack the Ripper. So Edwards devoted a significant amount of time to finding a relative of Kosminski that was willing to submit DNA for a test. He found one, again, a descendant of Aaron Kosminski's mother, and it turned out that the DNA from the male germ cells matched that of the descendant. This DNA test was performed by Dr. David Miller, who is an expert in forensic tests involving male germ cells. And the odds of a random match in this case were estimated to be 1.9 times 10 to the negative second. In other words, 19 out of 1,000 or basically 2 out of 100. So it looked like Aaron Kosminski's germ cells were on the shawl. Together, Dr. Lou Halanen and Dr. Miller published a paper titled Forensic Investigation of a Shawl Linked to the Jack the Ripper Murders. They published it in the Journal of Forensic Sciences, which is a peer-reviewed journal, so the paper passed peer review, and we'll have a link so that you can read the paper for yourself. And in view of the positive results linking the shawl to both Eddowes and Kosminski, the authors estimated that the chances of a random match were approximately 2.5 in 10 to the minus fifth. That is 2.5 out of 100,000 or 25 out of a million. So it looks like we have a tiebreaker between Kosminski, Kosminski, and Cohen. The DNA evidence points to Kosminski.
What was the reaction in the Ripperology community when this was announced?
Well, it depends. The results were first announced in 2014 before the paper came out, and the reaction was mixed. Some, particularly those who favored Aaron Kosminski, were happy, but those who supported other candidates were not, and they were harshly critical of the announcement. One of their harshest criticisms was that the results had not been peer-reviewed, but that's a criticism that Edwards and Lou Halanen were prepared for. They had planned to do a peer-reviewed article on the DNA results. They just didn't want to wait for that process to play out to announce what they'd found, and Lou Halanen planned to do such an article once the furor died down. So he and Dr. Miller got to work, and the article appeared in 2019.
And what was the reaction this time?
Again, it was mixed. As is common whenever someone publishes something scientifically interesting, people will try testing it. So there was some back and forth in the journals. Eventually, the Journal of Forensic Sciences decided to publish an expression of concern about the article. This is not the same thing as a retraction. A retraction occurs when the author or publishers of an article have fundamentally lost confidence in it and no longer consider it reliable. An expression of concern can be published when there are questions that have been raised about an article that haven't been resolved one way or the other. In this case, the expression of concern stated,
following an investigation by the publisher, the expression of concern has been agreed due to concerns raised by third parties after publication regarding the conclusions drawn from the mtDNA analysis performed by the authors. Related concerns were also summarized in 2 letters to the editor, published by the journal, to which the authors responded with their own letters to the editor. During the investigation, the publisher and editor-in-chief made every effort to obtain from the authors the original raw data from the mtDNA analysis. However, the authors stated that the data were no longer available due to instrument data failure and other complications. Through further investigation, it was concluded that, because it was not possible to examine the original data, no determination could be made regarding the third-party complaints. The journal is issuing this expression of concern because the concerns regarding the data and the results presented cannot be resolved. The authors have been informed about this expression of concern and agree to its publication.
So when questions were raised about the article, which is entirely normal, the authors encountered a problem. One of their data records had failed, maybe something like a hard drive crash, and they couldn't show the original raw data anymore. This is something that people who don't read scientific journals may not be aware of, but in many fields it is not normal to publish all of the raw data with an article. Instead, the article contains a summary of the results, and the raw data is kept on file for a period in case anyone wants to look at it. Unfortunately, in this case, that wasn't possible, so the journal decided to publish an expression of concern, and Luhalainen and Miller agreed since the data could no longer be examined.
What do you make of that?
Well, it would be better if the raw data was available so that the matter could be fully addressed. Since it's not, there must remain a question mark over the study until such time as someone reruns the tests. Of course, deliberate fraud is also a possibility, but you need evidence to accuse professional scientists like Luhalainen and Miller of fraud, and I don't have such evidence. And hard drives do crash, so I can't just write off this study. And based on the data we do have as published in the paper, I think it points in favor of Kosminski. In 2024, Edwards released a new edition of his book Naaman Jack the Ripper, and this was followed by a new round of press coverage of the claims. I encountered the coverage. A lot of it was very favorable towards Edwards, saying that he and his team had definitively identified Jack the Ripper, but I know that when something like this is announced, it's always going to get pushback, so I waited to see what the critics would say. I also read the book, and I have to say that I wasn't particularly impressed by Edwards as a writer. He spends a lot of time saying things that aren't particularly high value in terms of evidence. Instead, he's trying to tell a story about how he came to the conclusions he did. And this means that for me, with a focus on evidence, the book was rather frustrating. It's like, just give me the evidence, dude. I'm also aware of other criticisms of Edwards and his handling of other cases, but I looked into those and didn't find anything that would show that he was wrong about his essential claims. It's, the science that's important. When I then saw critics coming out and critiquing Edwards, I was very interested in what they'd have to say, but I wasn't particularly impressed by the critics either. They all had their own pet candidates for who Jack the Ripper was, and a lot of the criticisms were limited to claims like, well, there's enough uncertainty here that you couldn't prove this in court. In fact, it was claimed that you can't use DNA to identify a suspect in court, but only to exclude people from being suspects. I haven't looked into whether that's true about British courts, but I'm not in a court, so I'm not concerned with courtroom levels of proof. I'm not interested in whether we have evidence sufficient to convict Aaron Kosminski as Jack the Ripper. He's long dead. He's not going to be convicted. What I'm interested in is what the evidence points to regarding whether Kosminski was Jack the Ripper. And I acknowledged that a match to Kosminski's DNA was only 1.9 times 10 to the negative 2, or a 2 in 100 or 1 in 50 chance of a random match. But 1 in 50 still means that there's a 49 in 50 chance that the DNA in the male germ cells is from Kosminski. And so it doesn't deprive the findings of their evidential value from a historical standpoint rather than a legal standpoint. Of course, there is, as I discovered, a question mark about the article since we can't see the original raw data, but the evidence we have does still point towards Kosminski, and so I tentatively conclude that he was the most likely person to be Jack the Ripper. I can't prove that. I can't prove it in a court of law, but it seems to me that this is where the evidence currently points, and so Kosminski is my preferred subject at this point.
What about the arguments that Douglas made to challenge Kosminski, even if Jack the Ripper was someone very much like him, like David Cohen?
Well, I think having DNA seemingly linked to both Catherine Eddowes and Aaron Kosminski goes quite a way to overcome those concerns. The evidence points towards Kosminski rather than Cohen or Kaminsky, so it makes it more likely that Kosminski was the perpetrator, and that overcomes a good bit of the weight of the objections against him, which aren't really decisive. In addition, I've had a look at some notes that were taken by professionals on Kosminski while he was in the asylum. He was actually in more than one. And he had both auditory and visual hallucinations. And these would tell him to do things like refuse to be bathed, though he was noted to be otherwise clean in his habits. He was frequently said to be dull, quiet, apathetic, morose, stubborn, and lethargic. On the other hand, he was also said to get excited, demented, incoherent, noisy, and violent. At times, he would respond to questions, but at other times he would not answer, or he would just mutter, or he would answer incoherently. At one point, he was said not to know how old he was or how long he'd been in the institution. There's no way to be sure at this late date, but it sounds to me that he likely had schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, or bipolar disorder. And to cross-check myself, I contacted Mysterious Irregular Dr. Joseph Sheridan, who is a psychiatrist. I let him know what the case looked like to me, and to keep from prejudice in his read of the symptoms, I did not tell him Kosminski's name or that he was a possible candidate for Jack the Ripper. I just shared with him the psychiatric notes that were taken on Kosminski during his institutionalization. Dr. Sheridan wrote back and said,
"Hi, Jimmy. I agree with you. Most likely schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, or schizoaffective, which is essentially a combination of the two. This patient is described as having periods of heightened excitability and rages, as well as periods of being withdrawn, morose, or apathetic. The periods of agitation could be explained by the positive symptoms of schizophrenia, or possibly from a manic episode. Patients with schizophrenia often have predominant negative symptoms, consisting of being withdrawn and apathetic. But these symptoms could also be explained by a depressive episode of bipolar disorder. The patient is described as having psychosis, hallucinations, delusions, and nonsensical speech, which can be seen in schizophrenia or during manic episodes of bipolar disorder."
So it seems that the possible diagnoses I identified are plausible.
Does this shed any light on the concerns that Douglas raised?
Yes, one of Douglas's concerns was that we don't have reports of Kosminski claiming to be Jack the Ripper once he was institutionalized in the asylums. But I've also seen it reported that Kosminski spoke very little while he was institutionalized, and he sometimes responded to commands. And when he himself spoke, I've seen one of his medical notes saying that he only spoke German, which may mean Yiddish. So between his general silence and his German or Yiddish, I don't know that it's particularly surprising that we don't have a record of him claiming to be Jack the Ripper. Douglas also was troubled by his relative lack of violence in the asylum, but there were occasions when Kosminski was violent. And it's clear that his condition went through cycles, as in schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. Sometimes he was sluggish and unresponsive, but other times he was excitable and violent. So maybe the Ripper murders happened when he was in an excitable, violent phase. Also, Jack the Ripper's mania was triggered by prostitutes, and in the asylum, Kosminski wasn't in contact with those, so the focus of his obsessions wasn't there to trigger him. Then there's a point about the rival candidate, Cohen, that is mentioned by Edwards. In naming Jack the Ripper, he writes,
According to Swanson, the identification took place at the Seaside Home, which is popularly believed to refer to the Police Convalescent Seaside Home in Hove on the Sussex coast, near Brighton. As this establishment opened in 1890, Cohen could not have been identified there as he had died the year before.
And I verified that. The Police Convalescent Seaside Home in Hove began operations in March of 1890. but David Cohen died in October of 1889, 5 months earlier. So if this is correct, we can strike him off our list, since Jack the Ripper could not be David Cohen, but only someone like him. Which points us back to Aaron Kosminski, especially with the DNA evidence from the shawl. I thus tentatively conclude that Jack the Ripper was most likely Aaron Kosminski.
Before we close the reasoned perspective, let's look at one remaining matter. Whoever he was, Jack the Ripper did not kill that many women, just the canonical 5 that we're sure of. Other serial killers have slain many more. So why is Jack the Ripper so famous? Why does he loom so large in the public imagination?
I think it's a combination of factors, some of which may be a little surprising. Douglas writes,
For one, the crimes, a series of fatal stabbings that escalated into total mutilation, were concentrated in a small geographic area, directed at a specific type of preferred victim. For another, though there had been isolated sexually based killings in England and the European continent in the past, this was the first time most Victorians had ever faced or had to deal emotionally with such a phenomenon. Add to this a social reform movement and a newly energetic and outspoken press eager to call attention to the appalling living conditions in the East End, and you have all the ingredients for what became, literally, one of the biggest crime stories of all time.
Wikipedia also points out,
The Ripper murders mark an important watershed in the treatment of crime by journalists. Jack the Ripper was not the first serial killer, but his case was the first to create a worldwide media frenzy. The Elementary Education Act of 1880, which had extended upon a previous act, made school attendance compulsory regardless of class. As such, by 1888, more working-class people in England and Wales were literate. Tax reforms in the 1850s had enabled the publication of inexpensive newspapers with a wider circulation. These mushroomed in the later Victorian era to include mass circulation newspapers, costing as little as a halfpenny, along with popular magazines such as the Illustrated Police News, which made the Ripper the beneficiary of previously unparalleled publicity. Consequently, at the height of the investigation, over 1 million copies of newspapers with extensive coverage devoted to the Whitechapel murders were sold each day. However, many of the articles were sensationalistic and speculative, and false information was regularly printed as fact. In addition, several articles speculating as to the identity of the Ripper alluded to local xenophobic rumors that the perpetrator was either Jewish or foreign.
Then there were the letters, like the Dear Boss letter, the Saucy Jackie postcard, and the From Hell letter. While some or all of these may have been fake, they definitely excited the public imagination and contributed to the Jack the Ripper legend. I thus think a combination of factors, like new literacy and cheaper newspapers, set the stage for a killer like Jack the Ripper to emerge. So the field was already ripe in 1888. Then, when truly astonishingly horrific murders began to be committed against prostitutes, coupled with the dramatic taunting letters allegedly from the killer being published, the legend took off and made Jack the Ripper the most famous serial killer of all, even though his crimes would be dwarfed, unfortunately, by the actions of other killers.
Now, what can we say about Jack the Ripper from the faith perspective?
Well, first of all, murder bad. Thou shalt not kill is one of the 10 Commandments, after all. In addition, we can pray for everyone involved. That includes praying for the victims and everyone who mourned their loss, and it includes praying for the soul of Jack the Ripper himself, whoever he was.
And Jimmy, what's your bottom line?
Jack the Ripper was a frightening individual. He had some kind of mania that drove him to attack prostitutes and ritually mutilate them in horrific ways after they were dead, and he killed 5 in a period of just over 2 months. He may have killed a few more, though we're not sure about that. Jack the Ripper also appeared at just the right time and committed crimes so shocking that he went on to become the most famous serial killer of all time, though other killers have been objectively much worse. He almost certainly did not call himself Jack the Ripper, because that name originated in letters to newspapers that were fakes written by journalists to sell papers. but the name added to his mystique. In the 137 years since he committed his crimes, more than 100 suspects have been proposed. Some of them are absolutely ludicrous. The cases against many of them are flimsy. However, based on modern criminal profiling, it looks like Jack the Ripper was Aaron Kosminski or someone very much like him. And based on DNA evidence obtained from the silk shawl, it appears that the balance of probability points towards Kosminski as the actual historical Jack the Ripper.
And Jimmy, what further resources can we give to the listeners?
We'll have links to John Douglas's book, The Cases That Haunt Us, also Russell Edwards' book, Naming Jack the Ripper, some Daily Mail articles, also information about Whitechapel, John Pizer, Hoppin' Down in Kent, the Dear Boss letter, the Grand Lodge of British Columbia and the Yukon on the Three Ruffians, information about Aaron Kosminski, and Drs. Luhalainen and Miller's paper, Forensic Investigation of a Shawl linked to the Jack the Ripper murders.
All right. And now it's time to hear from you. What are your theories about Aaron Kosminski and the other candidates for who Jack the Ripper was? You can let us know by visiting sqpn.com or the Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World Facebook page, sending us an email to feedback@mysterious.fm, sending a tweet to @mys_world, visiting the StarQuest Discord community at sqpn.com/discord, or by calling our mysterious feedback line at 619-738-4515. That's 619-738-4515.
And I want to say a special word of thanks to Oasis Studio 7 for the video and animation work in this episode. Check it out by going to youtube.com/Jimmy Akin. And while you're there, please help me out. I'm trying to get up to 100,000 subscribers, and I'd love for you to be one of them. So like, comment, share the podcast, and subscribe. And when you subscribe, be sure and hit the bell notification so you'll always get notified when I have new videos. I also want to say a special thanks to Mysterious Irregular, Dr. Joseph Sheridan.
I also want to thank Anna Fontaine for her voiceover work on this episode. Jimmy, what's our next episode going to be about?
Next week, we're going to be looking at another mystery, but I'm not sure what it'll be. We're recording this episode early enough that I don't yet have a script for it written. So for the audience, as for me, the topic of next week's episode is currently a mystery.
Folks, be sure to follow Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, TuneIn, your favorite podcast app, or, as Jimmy said, at his YouTube channel, where you should make sure to hit that bell to get notifications. Get your very own Mysterious World t-shirt, mug, and more in our merchandise shop at sqpn.com/merch. You'll find links to Jimmy's resources from our discussion on our show notes at mysterious.fm/362. And remember, to help us continue to produce the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you in part through the generous support of Aaron Vergeson Electric and Automation, making connections for life for your automation and smart home needs in North and Central Florida at aaronv.com. And by Rosary Army, featuring award-winning Catholic podcasts, rosary resources, videos, and the School of Mary online community, prayer, and learning platform. Learn how to make them, pray them, and give them away while growing in your faith at rosaryarmy.com and schoolofmary.com. Until next time, Jimmy Akin, thank you for exploring with us our mysterious world.
Thanks, Dom.
And once again, I'm Dom Bettinelli. Thank you for listening to Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World on StarQuest.